Hello class, this is Dr. Anderson, and we are going to continue our discussion of the endocrine system. We've talked about cells and different kinds of hormones, and now we're going to talk about how those hormones are regulated. So here we have our learning objectives. We want to discuss the function of the endocrine system in the context of homeostasis, so we're going to discuss that concept. We're going to compare and contrast the communication between the hypothalamus and the anterior versus the posterior pituitary. We will discuss the negative feedback regulation of the three tiers of the endocrine system, and what I mean by that is the hypothalamus, the pituitary, namely the anterior pituitary, and the peripheral endocrine glands. And we will concentrate on three examples: growth hormone, cortisol, and thyroid hormone. And we want to explain how the regulation of prolactin differs from the other anterior pituitary hormones. So homeostasis is defined as a dynamic process. There's a lot of give and take used by the body to maintain an appropriate cellular environment. So one of the things you've learned about is that cells need to be in a saline solution that's high in sodium chloride and low in potassium. That extracellular fluid needs a certain osmolarity to be around 300 milliosmolar. It requires certain concentrations of oxygen and CO2 and a certain pH. There needs to be available glucose. And those vary within a physiologic range, for example, with circadian rhythms. So potassium levels, sodium levels, glucose levels vary within that physiologic range, but they have variability and they have circadian rhythms, and we're going to find hormones also have circadian rhythms. So there's that underlying rhythm, but there's also a mechanism through homeostasis to keep O2, to keep water balance, to keep hormone levels within a certain range. The major way we regulate parameters is through negative feedback. What that means is there's a physiologic response to some stimulus, and that response opposes the stimulus. That's the majority of our feedback mechanisms. It's very good for maintaining a set point. So body temperature varies via circadian rhythm, but varies, say, between 36 and 37 degrees, something like that. Your temperature is very low at night. It increases during the day. It peaks about in the afternoon, and then it drops again at night. However, there's a negative feedback mechanism that regulates the temperature. If your body temperature gets too high, you have hyperthermia, and therefore you will sweat and try to get your body temperature back to a set point. If your body temperature is too low, then you have hypothermia. You go out in the snow and you stay out there too long without the proper clothing, and you will try to shiver and you will vasoconstrict and you'll try to get your temperature back up. Same thing with blood pressure. Blood pressure fluctuates via a circadian rhythm. However, we have something called the baroreceptor reflex to maintain blood pressure within a certain physiologic range. And hormones fluctuate by circadian rhythms, but are within certain levels. How does this happen? Well, if you're going to regulate the level of a hormone or regulate blood glucose level or regulate temperature or whatever it is, then you have to have a receptor that's monitoring what that parameter is. That receptor then has an input pathway to some kind of integrating center. If it's a neural mechanism, then it's a sensory neuron going to the brain or the spinal cord, something like that. If it's an endocrine mechanism, your integrating center could be a gland. Anyway, you have a receptor, monitors a stimulus, an input pathway to an integrating center, an outward pathway to an effector, the effector then carries out a response that then opposes the original stimulus. Now sometimes we have positive feedback mechanisms. Positive feedback mechanisms are building mechanisms. The stimulus is reinforced by the response. Now these aren't as common, but very, very important. You're bringing a process to a completion point. So for example, with an action potential, you open some sodium channels that causes the cell to depolarize. You open up more sodium channels, which causes more depolarization. Or estrogen levels build, leading to more estrogen, leading to luteinizing hormone and more luteinizing hormone and more luteinizing hormone. You get this spike of LH and then you get ovulation. Once ovulation is over, the system goes back to negative feedback. So these are a couple of examples of positive feedback. All right, when we talk about the endocrine system, we start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is called the master gland. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, isn't the hypothalamus part of the brain? Well, it is, but it's also part of the endocrine system. And so the hypothalamus links up to the body through the pituitary gland and forms what we call an axis. The hypothalamus communicates with the posterior or with the anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary as well, but communicates with the pituitary, and then we get communication with other parts of the body. This explains how stress can affect your health and affect your physiologic function. If you're stressed out, then your hypothalamus is going to know about it. It's going to convey that to the endocrine system. The hypothalamus is full of neurons that produce hormones, and so we call them neurosecretory cells. Now they're like a neuron in every way. They have cell bodies, they have resting membrane potentials, they have voltage-gated sodium channels, they have sodium-potassium ATPases, they have leak channels, they have resting membrane potentials, they can elicit action potentials, they have axons. Action potentials go down the axons to an axon terminus, where you open up voltage-gated calcium channels and you get exocytosis. Everything you've learned about neurons, but instead of releasing a neurotransmitter, these cells release a hormone, and they release that hormone into the blood. Now let's talk about the posterior pituitary first. The posterior pituitary is an extension of the brain, and therefore the old-fashioned name is the neurohypophysis. It doesn't actually make anything. It doesn't synthesize hormone. It's merely the release site from the hypothalamus. So there's a cell body of a neuron in the hypothalamus. The axon is projected down to the posterior pituitary, and that's simply the release site. So the hormone is actually synthesized by the hypothalamus, but released from the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary then has a capillary bed that it exocytoses the hormone into the blood. And there are two hormones that are released in this fashion. One is called ADH, which when Dr. Katz tells you about the kidney, he may call this vasopressin. Two different terms for the same hormone. It has effects on the kidney. And then oxytocin is the other hormone. It has effects on the breast for the milk letdown reflex, effects on the uterus for labor and delivery. Now oxytocin also has effects in the central nervous system, so both males and females have oxytocin. It tends to be an anti-anxiety hormone, a bonding hormone, if you will. So ADH and oxytocin, the two hormones that are released by neurosecretory cells from the posterior pituitary. So here's a picture of that. Here's a picture of your brain. We're looking at this little part. This is the hypothalamus. There's a little stalk that leads us to the pituitary. If we blow this up, here we have some green neurons. Here's some neurons in a nucleus and some other neurons. Long axons that project through the stalk between the hypothalamus and the pituitary, and they then project to the posterior pituitary, synapse on capillaries, and then ADH or oxytocin are released into the venous blood. The venous blood takes oxytocin or ADH through the venous system to the right heart, through the lungs, to the left heart, and then to the systemic system where those hormones will find target cells and their receptors. Also over here you see the anterior pituitary, and it has, notice it has two capillary beds. We have neurons in the hypothalamus that synapse on the capillary bed at the base of the hypothalamus. Then we go through a portal system that then takes us to the anterior pituitary. Here's another picture of that from Vander. So here's the hypothalamic neuron releasing a releasing hormone into a capillary bed. We go through a portal system. Now what is a portal system? A portal system is a connection between two capillary beds and allows two capillary beds to communicate without going through the heart. Now, would those hormones go through the heart later? Sure they would. But we go straight from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary without going through the heart first. So we will learn about three portal systems. One is between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. Dr. Wu will tell you about the portal system in the GI system between the gut and the liver through the hepatic portal system. And then Dr. Katz will tell you about the third one between the glomerulus and the peritubular capillaries in the kidney. All right, so back to the anterior pituitary. So here's our neuron releasing hormone into a capillary bed. It goes through the portal system, finds its receptor on cells in the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, its old-fashioned name is the adenohypophysis. It is a true gland. And so when hormone from the hypothalamus binds to its receptors in the anterior pituitary, then the anterior pituitary produces a second hormone. And this is shown in greater detail here. Hormones come from the hypothalamus, bind to receptors, and then the cells in the posterior pituitary release hormone that go into the venous blood. All right, so I use my paint program to tell you about the two systems. So we have a number of releasing hormones: gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, dopamine, thyroid releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone. They're released from this neuron into the portal system, and that portal system then takes that hypothalamic hormone. It binds to its receptor in the anterior pituitary. These cells could produce FSH and LH, could produce prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Those are the stimulating hormones released from the anterior pituitary. Those are then going to go into the venous system. And then that's going to go to the right heart, through the lungs, to the left heart, and finally make it to its target organ. Now, these long hypothalamic neurons are going to release either ADH and oxytocin. So they make those hormones, package them in vesicles, send them down to the axon terminus, where they're released into the venous blood. Then go to the right heart, through the lungs, to the left heart, to the systemic circulation. So it is the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus that don't have to go through the heart. They are the ones using the portal system. Notice all are we seeing here are protein hormones. All of these are proteins and peptides. Proteins and peptides. Proteins and peptides. So we know they're working on plasma membrane receptors. We know they're working through second messenger systems. We know they have short half-lives. That's some of the material that we learned from the previous lecture. So we talk about an axis or three tiers of regulation. The hypothalamus produces releasing hormones. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, thyroid releasing hormone, corticotropic releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone. Then the anterior pituitary, or the adenohypophysis, secretes stimulating hormones. Growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. Then these hormones go out to the periphery. So growth hormone works on the liver and bone to produce IGF. Thyroid stimulating hormone works on the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone works on the adrenal gland to produce cortisol. Oops, look what we've got here. Here's our first steroid. And then gonadotropin releasing hormone causes the release of LH and FSH. LH and FSH then go to the gonads for the production of sex hormones. So here's one of the flow charts you see from your textbook. There's some stimulus. The hypothalamus makes the first hormone that goes through the portal system. The anterior pituitary makes the second hormone that goes into the plasma. And the peripheral gland makes the third hormone, which then talks to target cells and carries out the function that we associate with that system. So if we use growth hormone for an example, we have some stimulus. Growth hormone is stimulated by exercise. It's stimulated by short-term stress, by fasting, low plasma glucose. It has a circadian rhythm where it's released more at night when we're sleeping. So the hypothalamus produces a couple of hormones, growth hormone releasing hormone and somatostatin, which some people also call growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Growth hormone releasing hormone goes to the anterior pituitary, says release growth hormone. Growth hormone has its own effects, but then growth hormone also goes to the liver and bone and muscle and some other cells, and we get IGF, insulin-like growth factor 1. Then that goes out. Insulin-like growth factor 1 is a mitogen. It tells cells to divide and supports growth. Now what we see here is that IGF can feed back to inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone. We don't want IGF to increase without end, or growth hormone to increase without end. We have to have a way to shut it off. So insulin-like growth factor feeds back to the anterior pituitary to inhibit growth hormone, feeds back to the hypothalamus to inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone. It also feeds back to stimulate somatostatin, and that also helps shut down the system. So the regulation is quite complicated. So here's a picture from your textbook showing you all three layers. Growth, gonadotropin releasing hormone causing the release of FSH and LH, going to the gonads for gamete development and male and female hormones. We will have a lecture on female hormones, we'll have a lecture on male hormones, and so you will learn this system very well. In this lecture, we're talking about growth hormone releasing hormone, stimulating growth hormone, activating, having its own effects on metabolism, and then increasing IGF to increase cell division. When these substances are high enough, they feed back and inhibit growth hormone releasing hormone and stimulate somatostatin. We will also have a lecture on thyroid releasing hormone. Thyroid releasing hormone then goes to the anterior pituitary. We get thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes to the thyroid. And what's interesting here is we have two hormones, thyroxine, which is called T4, and triiodothyronine, which is called T3. Now, here's a unique situation. Dopamine is produced from the hypothalamus. It inhibits prolactin. And what does prolactin do? Well, prolactin causes milk production. Now, the people who need to be making high levels of prolactin are moms feeding babies. In everybody else, prolactin is mostly inhibited. So with breastfeeding, Dopamine then is inhibited, prolactin can increase, and then the mother can produce milk to feed her baby. Finally, we have corticotropin releasing hormone. That's a stress pathway leading to ACTH production and the stimulation of the adrenal cortex. We're not going to talk about the functions so much of the adrenal gland, but we certainly will talk about the feedback. All right, more about growth hormone. This is a bone, and we have a little cutaway so that you see there's this thick bone called compact bone, and then we have in the ends this spongy bone where the red bone marrow is. And right here, this little line here is called the epiphyseal growth plate. Before puberty, as a child is growing, that growth plate is made out of cartilage. That cartilage is able to proliferate and help the bone to grow. With maturation, at some point the cartilage is going to be exhausted, and this is all going to turn into bone. Then that person has reached their adult height. And here are some of the cells we see in bone. We have the cells that lay down the bone. We have the cells that break down bone. Now why do we need to break down bone? Because as this bone is getting bigger, we have to hollow out the center where the yellow marrow is. So we're adding bone to the outside and taking bone away from the inside, so the bone is growing in diameter but not in thickness. Then we have some some cells that are trapped in the middle of the bone. Those are the osteocytes, and they are the ones that maintain the bone. So what does growth hormone do? It causes the release of IGF-1. And IGF-1 is a mitogen. It causes mitosis. So cartilage cells are going to divide and grow. Skin cells are going to divide and grow. Liver cells, lung cells, all kinds of cells are going to grow, divide and grow, so a child can become a bigger person. As a person is getting taller, we call that linear growth, and that's going to happen before puberty. During puberty, kids are going to have a growth spurt, then their growth levels off, and then they reach their adult height. After puberty, then growth hormone is maintaining bone. Growth hormone does all kind of metabolic things. It increases protein synthesis, which is something you need to grow. It's also going to elevate blood glucose level. Remember that a low blood glucose level stimulates growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone. Growth hormone is going to do things to raise blood glucose level. So this is a cartoon from the New Yorker, and this guy may have used some suspect growth hormone. And I just put this in there that there's some stuff out there on the internet and things going on in sports that if growth hormone causes your muscle mass to grow and causes you to lay down protein and grow soft tissue, do you want to take growth hormone and be young and full of muscle and all that sort of thing? Well, there's a problem. There's a problem with that, and that is growth hormone raises your blood glucose level, and it makes you insensitive to insulin, which is essentially causing diabetes. So no, it's not a good idea to have an excess of growth hormone. Now, it depends on where you are in the lifespan as to what excess growth hormone does to you. If you're not completed with puberty and you have an excess of growth hormone, you will continue to grow the bones, and you'll be taller than average, and you'll have something called giantism, or another term is gigantism. Giantism, gigantism, they're both correct. After puberty, the epiphyseal plate has sealed. So you're not going to grow taller, but your bones will grow thicker. And excess growth hormone after puberty is something called acromegaly. So here are a couple of brothers. These two are identical twins, and one of them has gigantism. Can you guess which one it is? So this guy's much taller, bigger hands, bigger feet, So if you look at, and do you see that his joints are a little bit swollen here? A lot of proliferation of the soft tissue. So if you were to have a patient who has gigantism or has acromegaly, a lot of soft tissue growth, they're going to have a gigantic tongue. They're going to be a tough airway. It's not going to be easy to work in their mouth. And if you need to stick a needle somewhere, their skin is tough, their soft tissue is tough. It's not easy to poke them with a needle. So there's some interesting issues that come along with them. So this guy is taller than normal. Humans weren't really meant to be this tall. So he's putting a lot of weight on his joints. And as he grows older, he's going to be in a lot of pain because of his joint pain. He's going to have diabetic-like symptoms, and so people with gigantism tend to die of heart failure. Also notice his facial features, how prominent his jaw is, his forehead, showing the thickening of the bones. So we might fantasize, oh, wouldn't it be great to be really, really tall? I'm only 5'4", and I think, oh, I'd love to be tall. But it's not worth it for all the side effects that happen with excess growth hormone. All right, what about our stress hormone? The stimulus here is stress. When a person is stressed, you're running to catch the bus, you realize, oh my gosh, there's a pop quiz. Whatever it is, you're stressed out, you increase corticotropin releasing hormone. It goes into the portal system. The anterior pituitary releases ACTH, which goes out into the periphery and stimulates the adrenal gland, the cortex specifically, to produce cortisol. And cortisol then does things to help you withstand the stress. You need to be able to shut this loop off, so excess cortisol feeds back and inhibits ACTH and inhibits CRH by negative feedback. So let's think. We have a patient with a tumor on their left adrenal gland secreting excess cortisol. What happens to feedback in the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, and what happens to secretion from the right adrenal gland? Okay, so the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys. So we have adrenal gland here, and we have adrenal gland here. And when we draw pictures, we think about it from the patient's point of view. So this patient has a tumor on their left adrenal gland that's producing lots of, I wonder if I do this with my mouse, that's better, producing lots of cortisol. Already? That excess cortisol is going to feed back to the hypothalamus. What do you think we're going to do? We're going to inhibit the hypothalamus, and we're going to have less CRH. This excess cortisol is going to feed back to the anterior pituitary. We're going to have less ACTH. And if we have less ACTH, then we're going to have less cortisol from the right adrenal. Why don't we shut down the left adrenal? Why does it keep pumping out hormones? Because this is a tumor, and tumors don't listen to negative feedback. So what does cortisol do? I'll just briefly tell you that it's a steroid, so we know it works on intracellular receptors and changes gene transcription. It's a stress hormone. It helps us maintain our blood pressure during a stress, and it postpones inflammation in the short term until the emergency's over, and then you can go somewhere and heal. Now, it's a problem if you're constantly stressed. If you're constantly stressed, then you're constantly increasing your blood pressure, you're constantly messing with your inflammation, your immune system is kind of messed up. There are problems with chronic stress. It's fabulous for a short-term stress, but chronic stress, continued cortisol production is a problem. Critical thinking. Of the hormones in the cortisol axis, which must go through the heart before they reach their target? Well, we have CRH. It goes through the portal system, right? It doesn't have to go through the heart. We have ACTH. It goes into the venous blood. It has to go through the right heart, through the lungs, through the left heart. So ACTH has to go through the heart. And then we go to the adrenal gland and we get cortisol, which goes into the venous blood. Has to go to the right heart, to the lungs, to the left heart, out to the system and have its effects. So cortisol and ACTH go through the heart. CRH goes through the portal system to reach its target cell. Alrighty, so I hope you're finding this presentation helpful. This says we're going to do female reproduction next, and I'll just be kind of cagey. I haven't decided if I'm going to do female reproduction or if I'm going to do thyroid hormone. So consult the website about that, and I'll let you know what's coming up. If you have questions, please shoot me an email, and I would be happy to answer your question, or catch me in class or after class. So thank you for working hard, and I'll see you next time.